Before dawn on August 21, 1942, around 3:10 a.m., roughly 200 Japanese soldiers stormed across the narrow strip of sand at Alligator Creek on Guadalcanal. The moonlight revealed their silhouettes rushing toward Marine defenses. In the shadows, American machine gunners followed their advance through their sights. 20 yards, then 15, then 10. The enemy was close enough for the Marines to recognize faces, hear ragged breathing, and brace for grenades. Every instinct demanded they open fire. Every field manual said to engage long before this range. Any veteran knew you never let an assault get so close. But that night, the Marines disobeyed all doctrine. They were following Major General Alexander Vandegrift's plan, a plan that turned the battlefield into a math equation. Pre-measured artillery coordinates, precisely overlapping fields of machine gun fire, and 37mm canister ammunition, each round packed with 122 steel balls, weighted like enormous shotgun shells in the dark. The Japanese believed they were about to rout another undermanned American outpost through aggression and night fighting. They had no idea they were stepping into the most carefully engineered killing zone the Marine Corps had ever constructed. Sometimes letting the enemy come too close isn't a mistake. It's the trap. Colonel Kiyona Ichiki stood aboard the destroyer Kagero as it cut through the Black Pacific toward Guadalcanal, gripped by what Japanese leaders were calling victory disease, the belief that American forces would collapse under the same kind of relentless spirit that had defeated Chinese armies again and again. His regiment had originally been assigned to participate in the capture of Midway, a mission canceled after Japan's shocking defeat there. His men had been denied glory, and they wanted it back. Japanese reconnaissance on August 12th suggested the Marines around Henderson Field were scattered and lethargic. When Ichiki's forward detachment landed at Taivu Point, 25 miles from the Marine lines, they radioed that they had encountered no opposition. Tokyo estimated the Americans had maybe 3,000 demoralized troops on the island. Ichiki had 917 elite soldiers. On paper, a swift night assault would break the Americans and restore momentum to Japan's war effort. What he could not know was that Vandegrift commanded closer to 11,000 Marines and had spent 2 weeks reinventing how Marines defend terrain. Traditional Marine doctrine emphasized aggressive action and rapid maneuver. Vandegrift was doing something radical, turning defense into precision engineering. He began with the ground itself. Studying the terrain like a civil engineer, he noted that any eastern attack would be forced toward a single low-tide crossing at the mouth of Alligator Creek. North lay open ocean, south thick jungle that a battalion couldn't pass through. Anyone attacking from the east would have no choice but to funnel across that narrow sandbar. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commanding 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, initially resisted this passive mindset. Marines were trained to engage the enemy far forward, not let them walk up to grenade range. But as he inspected firing lanes and gun placements day after day, he realized this was not passivity, it was geometry. This was mathematics as warfare. Water-cooled Browning M1917A1 heavy machine guns were positioned with overlapping fields of fire. Each crew drilled to cover its exact sector. Mortars and artillery were pre-calculated to strike unseen, in total darkness. And most importantly, the 37mm M3 anti-tank guns were loaded with canister, a weapon designed to devastate tightly packed infantry at short range. Marines had always fired from hundreds of yards away when possible. Vandegrift ordered them to hold fire until Japanese troops were within 30 yards, close enough to throw grenades into the lines. The psychological strain would be extreme. But at that distance, a single canister round would rip through entire clusters of attackers in an instant. Private First Class Frank Pomeroy, manning a Browning near the creek, wrestled with the paradox. His weapon could fire up to 600 rounds per minute without overheating. But waiting so long meant some Japanese soldiers would inevitably break through. The entire plan relied on perfect timing and total faith in the overlapping fires. Company G, held as the mobile reserve, had perhaps the hardest job of all, waiting, listening, and trusting that the killing zone would work. If not, they would have to counterattack immediately in the darkness. As night fell on August 20th, coast watchers confirmed a large Japanese movement westward. The Marines along Alligator Creek did not know they were part of a tactical experiment that would redefine defensive doctrine in the Pacific. They only knew their general had ordered them to let the enemy come dangerously close and to trust mathematics over instinct. Pollock had spent hours analyzing the landscape. The creek ran north to south before bending to the sea, forming a natural barrier. The Marines held the slightly higher western bank, giving them observation and fire advantage. The crossing zone was less than 50 yards wide, a perfect funnel. Machine guns were placed like surgical tools. Ranges to every log, stump, and sand ridge had been recorded during daylight. At night, crews could shift fire purely by calculated reference points. Artillery crews of the 11th Marines had rehearsed the same precision, fires delivered unseen, based on coordinate math instead of line of sight. The battlefield had been reduced to numbers, angles, and fatal probability.
Forward observers from the 11th Marines had carefully plotted artillery concentration points on the eastern bank of Alligator Creek. During daylight, they recorded precise distances and compass bearings, then charted them for the gun crews positioned miles away. What would traditionally be a guessing game in the dark was transformed into mathematical precision. A single fire request from the observers meant the artillery crews could dial in exact settings, confident that rounds would strike exactly where intended, no visual confirmation required. The centerpiece of the defensive plan remained the 37mm anti-tank guns. Designed to stop armor, they were now being used for something even more lethal in this terrain: shredding infantry. Each M3 gun was loaded with M2 canister shells, 122 steel balls per round. Fired at short distances, they spread in a widening storm of metal covering the entire width of the crossing point. At 20 to 30 yards, each ball retained deadly velocity. The sand spit would become a kill corridor. The psychological strain on the defenders was immense. PFC Pomeroy and his crew had drilled the tactic repeatedly, but nothing in training prepared them to watch armed enemies advance to grenade range without firing. Under normal circumstances, a Browning 1917 A1 could accurately hit targets at 800 to 1,000 yards. Now they had to wait until the enemy was close enough to see expressions. They knew some Japanese would likely make it to the Marine lines. Each component of the defense had a precise role. The 37mm guns would fire first as the Japanese entered the kill zone. Only after the canister rounds had been expended would the machine guns erupt with overlapping fire to wipe out survivors. Artillery would strike the eastern bank to prevent additional waves from supporting the assault. Timing mattered more than firepower. Shooting too early would scatter the attackers and ruin the funnel. Shooting too late risked disaster. Company G stood ready behind the line, an immediate counterattack force in case Japanese troops broke through. Their job demanded unbreakable trust. They needed to believe that the math would work, and to act only if it didn't. The engineering behind this defense went beyond angles and charts. Ammunition allocation, barrel cooling, and controlled bursts were considered in detail. The water-cooled guns could fire indefinitely only if ammunition was managed wisely. Artillery crews stocked extra shells in strict firing programs. The 37mm guns carried limited canister, so every shot had to count. As darkness fell on August 20th, the Marines understood they were testing a concept that challenged generations of Marine tradition. Their success depended not on charging forward, but on discipline, teamwork, and mathematics. War at point-blank range would now favor the side that understood geometry. Mathematics was about to meet warfare at 20 yards. At 3:10 a.m., the sound of splashing water cut through the night as roughly 200 Japanese soldiers stepped into the shallow mouth of Alligator Creek. Pomeroy pressed his eye to his Browning's rear sight, watching figures emerge into the moonlight. His weapon was ready, range set, traverse locked to its assigned sector. Every instinct screamed at him to fire now while the enemy was exposed on open sand. But he held. The Japanese advanced with the confidence of men accustomed to night assaults, whispering orders, stumbling through deeper channels, swallowing frustration as equipment clattered against rocks. Many had seen similar operations succeed countless times in China. Why would tonight be different? They were unaware they were marching into a geometry lesson with lethal consequences. 25 yards from the western bank, then 20, 15. Now close enough for the Marines to pick out individual faces. Close enough to hear the breathing of men who believed that willpower could defeat machine guns. At 10 yards, Pollock gave the command that Marines had been straining to hear. Fire. The line erupted. The 37mm guns fired first with canister shells, exploding into a swarm of steel. Each blast swept the crossing point like a scythe, bodies collapsing in sudden chaos. The Japanese formation shattered instantly. Before shot could give way to recovery, the heavy machine guns joined in. Pomeroy squeezed his trigger, the water-cooled weapon rumbling as it threw a curtain of fire across the kill zone. He swept his sector methodically while the guns to his left and right sealed the gaps. No pathway remained unguarded. What had begun as a confident assault dissolved into confusion and horror. Survivors of the initial blast ran straight into intersecting fire patterns that offered no cover and no escape. The geometry of the defense was proving brutally effective. Still, some Japanese soldiers pushed through the storm, driven by training, desperation, or sheer momentum. A handful reached the Marine positions, firing pistols, throwing grenades, and launching desperate close-quarters attacks. For a moment, the perfection of the plan bent under the chaos of real combat. Random chance and individual bravery introduced variables that no mathematical model could fully eliminate. Then, the final part of the equation activated. Company G surged forward in a rehearsed counterattack. Machine guns continued to rake the far bank while the reserve Marines eliminated the few Japanese who had made it across. No foothold would be allowed to survive. No radio call for reinforcements would go out. The trap had sprung exactly as designed.
Even as Company G restored the defensive line, the night was far from over. Japanese mortars and 70mm infantry guns on the eastern bank began pounding the Marines, trying to pin them down long enough to organize a new assault. Shells burst across the beach and defensive positions, lighting the battlefield with violent flashes that revealed the bodies scattered across the sandspit. Marines flinched instinctively as shrapnel hissed overhead, but they held their ground. Pomeroy kept his Browning locked on his sector, ignoring the explosions creeping closer and closer. The water jacket around his machine gun throbbed with heat, but the cooling tank kept the weapon firing smoothly, proof that engineering mattered as much as bravery. The Marines had demonstrated that their defensive model worked, but the Japanese still controlled the eastern bank, and they were not done attacking. Their commanders were convinced that organization and weight of numbers, not flawed tactics, had doomed the first wave. So they tried again. Roughly 150 Japanese soldiers, another company-sized force, advanced down the same moonlit strip of sand. There was no attempt to change direction or adapt fundamentally, just a belief that more men, better coordinated, would succeed where others failed. Pomeroy saw them emerge, stepping among the corpses of their comrades. They moved in tight formation this time, officers barking orders and maintaining discipline. It looked more professional and even more doomed. The Marines had improved too. The 37mm crews had reloaded fresh canister. Machine gunners had adjusted their stakes to erase the narrow gaps that had let a few survivors reach the bank earlier. Artillery observers confirmed that the pre-targeted concentrations were still spot on. Once the attackers hit the exact mathematical trigger point, Pollock gave the familiar order, and once more, geometry turned into violence. The second wave was obliterated even faster than the first. Canister shells tore open the center of the formation, metal spheres sweeping the sandspit clean. Those who survived the initial blast ran directly into machine gun fire, more precise than before. The system was learning in real time, becoming more efficient with each test. This defense was evolving into something terrifying. A machine that turned human courage into a variable and solved for zero. Desperate to break the stalemate, Japanese commanders finally tried something different. They ordered a flanking attack through the surf north of the creek, forcing soldiers to advance chest-deep in water, with rifles held overhead. The idea was clever: move where the kill zone wasn't. But Vandegrift had designed a defense without blind spots. Marines at the northern end of the line had clear fields of fire into the surf. The Japanese struggled forward, slowed by waves, unable to aim or take cover. Artillery, pre-registered for exactly this scenario, began firing, sending columns of water and sand into the air. Machine guns poured bullets into soldiers who were already fighting the ocean just to stay upright. What might have been a tactical success elsewhere became yet another chapter in Vandegrift's mathematical lesson. With the enemy pinned on all fronts, dawn brought the final act of the battle. Vandegrift ordered a maneuver that completed the equation: a sweeping flank to crush the remaining Japanese from behind. Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell and 1st Battalion 1st Marines crossed Alligator Creek far inland, then drove down the eastern bank. Artillery kept the Japanese disorganized as Marines sealed off escape routes. The envelopment closed like a vice. Then came the tanks, rolling across the same sandbar that had been a killing zone hours earlier. One tank struck a mine, but the others pressed forward, adding crushing firepower at point-blank range. And finally, American air power arrived. Marine Fighter Squadron 223, newly arrived at Henderson Field, strafed the beach, finishing the job and ensuring no breakout was possible. By late afternoon, the Japanese force had been annihilated. What began as a night assault fueled by victory disease ended in a demonstration that mathematics could be as deadly as any bayonet. When the battlefield fell silent on August 22nd, the numbers told the story. Vandegrift's evolution in defensive warfare wasn't a theory anymore. It was proven in blood, steel, and perfect geometry.
By the end of the fighting, the results were visible everywhere. Between 774 and 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead across the sandspit and the surrounding shoreline. Bodies arranged almost geometrically, each position silently reflecting the precision of overlapping fire and canister patterns. Only 15 survivors from Colonel Ichiki's landing force were taken prisoner, all wounded, all unable to keep fighting. American losses were a fraction of that number, between 34 and 44 killed, with roughly 75 wounded. On the sandspit itself, the exchange ratio neared 20 Japanese killed for every Marine. It was a statistical validation of Vandegrift's gamble, and it exceeded even his most optimistic predictions. Colonel Ichiki's fate symbolized the collapse of traditional Japanese offensive doctrine. Some accounts suggest he died by his own hand after realizing the scale of the catastrophe. Other sources offer uncertainty. But no historian disputes the significance. A commander once celebrated across Asia had failed to comprehend a new kind of warfare, one where mathematics mattered more than morale. The psychological impact reached far beyond Guadalcanal. Japan's senior leadership now faced a grim question. What if the Americans would not crack after all? On the western bank, Pomeroy inspected his Model 1917 A1 Browning. The water-cooled barrel still radiated heat, a mechanical reminder that the weapon had performed exactly as engineered. The cooling jacket prevented catastrophic overheating even after prolonged firing at sustained cyclic rates. The artillery had been just as dependable. Rounds fell within yards of their plotted points, proof that mathematics could achieve accuracy beyond anything that relying on eyesight alone allowed. The Battle of Alligator Creek wasn't just a tactical win, it was science turning into strategy. Vandegrift had proved that modern defense rewarded systematic engineering over reckless courage, that fire discipline and geometry could achieve results textbooks insisted were impossible. The most radical part of the plan, allowing an enemy force to close in within grenade range, had shattered decades of Marine Corps teaching, yet it produced one of the most decisive American victories of the early Pacific War. And the blueprint would soon be tested again. 3 weeks later, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi launched a major night assault around 3,000 troops on what would become known as Edson's Ridge. Once more, prepared positions, pre-registered artillery, interlocking fields of fire, and disciplined restraint proved decisive. Kawaguchi's forces suffered 700 to 800 killed. American casualties were close to 100. The mathematics held, even as the scale of battle multiplied. Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, walking the field after the fight, understood that they had helped introduce a new age. The precision of overlapping fires, the lethality of canister at point-blank range, the accuracy of plotted artillery all proved that war could be calculated. Courage still mattered, but without discipline, bravery alone would fail. Across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima, American bases and beachheads would apply what began at Alligator Creek. Commanders would willingly trade terrain for mathematical certainty, pulling attackers into engineered kill zones where firepower could be focused and decisive. The formula would repeat itself again and win. The human element hadn't been forgotten. The warning provided by Jacob Vuza, the Solomon Islander who escaped Japanese torture to alert the Marines, made the defensive trap possible. Without his intelligence, timing, direction, force strength, all the engineering precision would have been meaningless against an enemy who never arrived. The final lesson of Alligator Creek was the simplest. The Marines had won because they turned a night assault into arithmetic, and they solved the equation at 20 yards. Traditional thinking demanded stopping the enemy far from the lines, keeping hand-to-hand combat and grenades at bay. Vandegrift had overturned that belief completely. He embraced geometry, timing, and interlocking fires that made point-blank combat not a risk, but a guarantee of victory. It marked the beginning of a new era. The age of defensive engineering had arrived, and it would define the future of infantry warfare.